The icy wind howled across the Wyoming mountains as Rebecca Dawson clutched the tattered remnants of her wedding dress, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold of October 1876. She had never imagined that fleeing her own wedding would lead her to this precarious moment. Balanced on the edge of a narrow switchback trail with nothing but a 1,000-foot drop beneath her trembling feet. Rebecca's legs refused to move, her entire body frozen not just from the cold but from absolute terror. The satin slippers she wore meant for dancing at her wedding reception, not climbing mountain trails, offered no traction on the icy path. One wrong step would send her plummeting to the jagged rocks below. Tears streamed down her wind-burned cheeks, quickly turning to ice in the biting cold. "Don't move, miss." A deep voice called from behind her. The sound startled Rebecca, nearly causing her to lose her already tenuous footing. She dared not turn around, her fingers digging into the rock face beside her. "I said don't move," the voice repeated, softer this time. "I'm coming to help you." She heard the crunch of boots on gravel, the jingle of spurs, and the soft nickering of a horse. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone dismounting. "Name's Wyatt Blackburn," the voice said, closer now. "I'm going to get you off this ledge, but you need to trust me." Rebecca swallowed hard, her throat raw from the cold. I can't move. You don't have to, not yet." His voice was steady, calm, the kind of voice that could soothe spooked horses or, apparently, terrified runaway brides. Wyatt approached carefully, his steps deliberate on the narrow path. Rebecca could feel his presence behind her now, solid and reassuring. The scent of leather, coffee, and pine needles wafted toward her, somehow comforting in this moment of terror. "I'm going to stand right beside you," Wyatt explained. "Then I'm going to take your hand. All you need to do is hold on." True to his word, he edged beside her, placing himself between Rebecca and the sheer drop. She caught her first glimpse of him then, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that had seen its share of hardships. His eyes, though, were surprisingly gentle, a warm brown that reminded her of autumn afternoons. "Give me your hand," he said, reaching out to her. Rebecca hesitated, her fingers still clinging to the rock face. "Trust me," Wyatt said simply. Something in his steady gaze gave her the courage to release her death grip on the rocks and place her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm despite the cold. "Good," he nodded approvingly. "Now, we're going to take one step at a time. I won't let you fall." Rebecca nodded mutely, unable to speak through her fear. "First step," Wyatt instructed, guiding her foot to a secure placement. "That's it. Now the other." With infinite patience, Wyatt led Rebecca along the treacherous switchback, one painstaking step at a time. He positioned himself on the edge side of the trail, placing his body as a barrier between her and the abyss. Each time she hesitated or faltered, his hand would tighten around hers, an anchor in her storm of fear. "You're doing fine," he encouraged as they navigated a particularly narrow section. "Just a little further, and we'll be on wider ground." It seemed to take hours, though it was probably no more than 20 minutes before the trail widened enough for Rebecca to breathe again. Her legs gave way beneath her as soon as they reached a relatively flat area, and she sank to the ground, trembling from exertion and fading adrenaline. Wyatt knelt beside her, shrugging off his heavy coat and draping it around her shoulders. The warmth enveloped her immediately, carrying that same scent of leather and pine. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, clutching the coat around her. "I thought I was going to die up there." "What in tarnation were you doing on that trail anyway?" Wyatt asked, his brow furrowing. "And in?" He gestured at her torn and mudded wedding dress. "That's hardly suitable attire for mountain climbing." Rebecca let out a choked laugh that was more like a sob. I wasn't planning on climbing any mountains today. I was supposed to be getting married. Wyatt's eyebrows rose. Supposed to be. I ran, she said simply, looking down at her torn dress. I couldn't go through with it. Wyatt studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if he understood completely. Well, Rebecca Dawson, Miss Dawson, it's getting dark and these mountains are no place to be at night. My cabin is about an hour's ride from here. I can offer you shelter until morning. Rebecca hesitated. The prospect of going with a stranger to his remote cabin should have terrified her. But after facing death on that cliff edge, few things seemed frightening in comparison. Besides, this man had just saved her life, showing remarkable patience and care in the process. I don't have many options, do I? She said with a weak smile. Not unless you fancy becoming acquainted with the mountain lions, Wyatt replied with a hint of humor. Can you ride? Rebecca nodded. She'd grown up on a small farm outside of Cheyenne and had been riding since she was a child. Good, Wyatt said, standing and extending a hand to help her up. My horse, Thunder, is just up ahead. He's strong enough to carry us both. Thunder proved to be a massive Palomino stallion with intelligent eyes that regarded Rebecca curiously, as Wyatt helped her mount. The horse's back was broad and warm, a welcome relief from the biting cold. Wyatt swung up behind her, his chest a solid presence against her back as he reached around to take the reins. Hold on, he advised, and Rebecca gripped the saddle horn as Thunder began moving down the trail at a careful pace. As they rode, the setting sun cast long shadows across the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of gold and crimson. In other circumstances, Rebecca might have found the view breathtaking. Now, she was simply grateful to be alive to see it. So, Wyatt's voice came from behind her, his breath warm against her ear. You want to tell me why a beautiful woman runs away from her own wedding and ends up nearly falling off a mountain? Rebecca tensed, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. Yet something about Wyatt Blackburn inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he had so carefully led her to safety, or maybe it was the lack of judgment in his voice now. I was supposed to marry Harold Pinkerton today, she began. Son of Ezra Pinkerton, the railroad baron. Wyatt asked, surprise evident in his voice. Rebecca nodded. The very same. It was an arrangement. My father owed Mr. Pinkerton a significant amount of money. This marriage was to settle the debt. Sounds more like a business transaction than a wedding, Wyatt observed. Exactly, Rebecca sighed. I met Harold 3 times before today. He's not unkind, but he's 30 years my senior and views a wife as just another possession. I tried to accept my fate, truly I did, but when I was standing there in the church about to say my vows, she trailed off. You chose freedom instead, Wyatt finished for her. I chose freedom, she agreed. Though I didn't plan very well, I just ran, grabbed a horse and rode as hard as I could. When I hit the mountain trails, I thought no one would follow me up here. But I didn't account for the terrain or the weather. Or proper footwear, Wyatt added, and Rebecca could hear the smile in his voice. She laughed softly. Or proper footwear, she agreed. The horse I took spooked at a rattlesnake about 2 miles back, threw me and ran off. I continued on foot, but then I hit that narrow switchback and, well, you know the rest. The Pinkertons aren't known for giving up what they consider theirs, Wyatt said after a thoughtful pause. They'll come looking for you. Rebecca's heart sank. She hadn't thought beyond her escape, hadn't considered the consequences. What will I do? First, we get you warm and fed, Wyatt said practically. Tomorrow's problems can wait for tomorrow. They rode in companionable silence for the remainder of the journey. Rebecca found herself relaxing against Wyatt's chest, drawing comfort from his steady presence. The rhythm of Thunder's hooves and the gentle sway of his gait nearly lulled her to sleep despite her precarious circumstances. As dusk deepened into night, lights appeared in the distance. Wyatt's cabin proved to be larger than Rebecca had expected, a solid structure of timber and stone that looked like it had weathered many harsh Wyoming winters. A small barn stood nearby, and a corral where several horses gazed curiously at their approach. "Home sweet home," Wyatt announced as they reached the cabin. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Rebecca down. Her legs nearly buckled as she slid from the horse's back, and Wyatt caught her easily. "Easy there," he murmured. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire already burning low. The main room contained a sturdy table with chairs, a bookshelf filled with volumes, and comfortable-looking furniture. Rebecca noticed hunting rifles mounted on the wall, alongside what appeared to be a cavalry saber. "You served?" she asked, nodding toward the saber. Wyatt followed her gaze and nodded. "Union Army, joined up in '63, just turned 18, served until the end." "My father and brother both fought," Rebecca said softly. "My brother didn't come home." Something passed between them, then an understanding of shared loss. Wyatt simply nodded, respecting her grief without needing to fill the silence with empty words. "I need to tend to Thunder," he said after a moment. "Make yourself comfortable. There's stew in the pot by the fire that should still be warm." Left alone, Rebecca explored the cabin more thoroughly. Despite its remote location, it contained unexpected touches of refinement, well-crafted furniture, a collection of books that included poetry and philosophy, alongside practical manuals on hunting and horse breeding. This man was more than the simple frontiersman he appeared to be. She ladled some stew into a bowl, surprised at how ravenous she felt now that the immediate danger had passed. The stew was hearty and delicious, filled with venison, potatoes, and wild onions. She was on her second helping when Wyatt returned, stamping snow from his boots. "I see you found the food," he remarked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "It's wonderful," Rebecca said sincerely. "I hadn't realized how hungry I was." "Fear will do that," Wyatt replied, removing his gun belt and hanging it beside his hat. "Makes you forget everything else until you're safe again." He moved to a trunk near the back wall and pulled out some clothing. "These might be a bit large, but they'll be warmer and more comfortable than that dress. There's a screen in the corner if you'd like to change." Rebecca accepted the offered clothing, a flannel shirt and woolen trousers, with gratitude. Behind the privacy screen, she struggled out of her ruined wedding dress, feeling a strange sense of liberation as she stepped out of the once beautiful gown. The simple act of changing clothes felt symbolic, as if she were shedding her old life along with the dress. Wyatt's clothes enveloped her like a tent, but after rolling up the sleeves and pant legs, she managed to make them serviceable. When she emerged from behind the screen, Wyatt had his back to her, adding logs to the fire. He turned at the sound of her approach, and something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. "Better?" he asked. Rebecca nodded. "Much, thank you." He gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit. Your slippers are soaked through. Let me see to your feet before they freeze." Before she could protest, Wyatt was kneeling before her, gently removing her sodden satin slippers. Her feet were pale and numb from cold, and she winced as he began to rub them between his hands, restoring circulation. "I'm sorry," he said when she gasped in pain. "It'll hurt as the feeling comes back, but it's necessary." Rebecca bit her lip as pinpricks of sensation returned to her toes. Wyatt's hands were calloused but gentle, working methodically to warm her chilled feet. The simple act of care made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You've been very kind," she said softly. "I don't know how to repay you." Wyatt looked up, meeting her eyes. "You don't owe me anything, Miss Dawson. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rebecca shook her head. "Not anyone. Most would have ridden past, not wanting to get involved. Or worse, they might have recognized me and tried to return me to the Pinkertons for a reward." Wyatt's expression darkened slightly. "I'm not most people." "No," Rebecca agreed quietly. "You certainly aren't." When her feet were warmed and dried, Wyatt provided her with thick woolen socks and a pair of moccasins that, while still too large, were infinitely more practical than her wedding slippers. "You should rest," he said, straightening. "You've had quite a day. You can take the bed." "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Rebecca started to protest, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. The emotional and physical toll of the day crashed over her like a wave, and suddenly the prospect of sleep was irresistible. The bed in the small adjoining room was simple but comfortable, with a thick quilt and clean sheets that smelled of sunshine and pine. As Rebecca slipped beneath the covers, she heard Wyatt moving quietly in the main room, banking the fire for the night. For the first time since she had fled the church that morning, she felt truly safe. Sleep claimed her quickly, but it was fitful. She dreamed of falling, of Harold Pinkerton's cold eyes, of her father's disappointment. She woke with a start sometime in the darkest part of night, disoriented and frightened until she remembered where she was. Unable to return to sleep, Rebecca wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and padded into the main room. Wyatt was awake, sitting in a chair by the low burning fire, cleaning a rifle by its light. He looked up as she entered. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Rebecca shook her head. "Bad dreams." Wyatt set aside the rifle and gestured to the other chair. "I know something about those." She settled beside him, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For a while they just sat in companionable silence, watching the fire's dying embers. "What will you do now?" Wyatt finally asked. "The Pinkertons won't give up easily." Rebecca sighed, the weight of her situation settling back onto her shoulders. "I don't know. I can't go home. That's the first place they'll look. I have an aunt in California, but I have no money for passage." "You have skills." "I can read and write well enough to teach," Rebecca said. "I can sew, cook, tend gardens. Nothing extraordinary." "Those are valuable skills out here," Wyatt pointed out. "Frontier towns are always in need of teachers." "Perhaps," Rebecca acknowledged, "but I'd need to get far enough away that the Pinkertons won't find me. And I'll need a new name, new identity." The enormity of starting over suddenly overwhelmed her, and tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't think any of this through. I just knew I couldn't marry him." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "I'm heading to Montana in a few days," he said finally. "Taking some horses to sell in Helena. You could come along if you wanted. It would give you time to figure out your next steps, and Helena's far enough from Cheyenne that you might find some peace there." Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "You would do that? Take me all the way to Montana?" Wyatt shrugged, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "The journey's safer with two, and I could use the company." It was a practical explanation, but Rebecca sensed there was more to his offer. Still, she didn't press. Whatever his reasons, his offer represented hope, a way forward when she had seen none. "Thank you," she said simply. "I accept." Wyatt nodded, as if the matter were settled. "We'll leave at first light the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll need to get you proper traveling clothes and supplies." "I have no money," Rebecca reminded him. "Consider it an advance on your wages," Wyatt said. "You can help with the horses during the journey and in Helena until you find your feet." The simple practicality of his solution moved her deeply. He wasn't offering charity, but partnership, a way for her to maintain her dignity while accepting his help. "You're a good man, Wyatt Blackburn," she said softly. Something like discomfort crossed his face. "I've made my share of mistakes," he said, "but I try to do right when I can." They spent the remainder of the night talking about books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they still harbored. Rebecca learned that Wyatt had come west after the war, unable to settle back into civilian life in his native Pennsylvania. He had worked as a scout for the Army, then as a ranch hand, before saving enough to buy his own land and start breeding horses. "They make more sense to me than people most days," he admitted. "Horses don't lie or deceive. They're straightforward creatures." As dawn's first light filtered through the cabin windows, Rebecca realized they had talked through the entire night. Yet she felt more refreshed than if she had slept soundly. There was something about Wyatt's steady presence that soothed her troubled spirit. After a breakfast of cornbread and strong coffee, Wyatt announced they would ride into the nearest town for supplies. "It's about 10 miles, he explained. "We should be there by midday." He provided Rebecca with a spare coat and a wide-brimmed hat to help disguise her appearance. "Just in case," he said. "Word travels fast, even in these parts." The town of Pine Ridge proved to be little more than a cluster of buildings serving the needs of surrounding ranches and farms. A general store, saloon, small hotel, livery stable, and a few other businesses lined its single dusty street. Rebecca kept her head down as they tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the general store, acutely aware of curious glances from the few townsfolk out and about. Inside the store, Wyatt efficiently gathered the supplies they would need: provisions for the journey, a bedroll for Rebecca, sturdy boots, and practical clothing suited for trail riding. "Outfitting the missus for travel, Mr. Blackburn?" the storekeeper asked with friendly curiosity. Before Wyatt could respond, Rebecca stepped forward. "My brother is taking me to visit our ailing mother in Montana," she said smoothly, adopting a slight southern accent different from her natural speech. "So kind of him to make this journey with me." The storekeeper nodded sympathetically. "Family's important. Hope your ma recovers quickly." Rebecca felt a momentary pang of guilt at the lie, but it dissipated quickly. Her very survival might depend on such deceptions now. As Wyatt paid for their purchases, Rebecca browsed the store's modest selection of books, eventually selecting a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. "A luxury," she acknowledged when Wyatt raised an eyebrow, "but one that will make the journey more pleasant." He added it to their purchases without comment. They were nearly back to the cabin when Rebecca spotted riders on the horizon behind them. "Wyatt," she said, her voice tense with alarm. He followed her gaze, then calmly said, "Just keep riding. Don't look back again." Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to sit naturally in the saddle as Thunder maintained his steady pace. "You think they're looking for me?" "Could be," Wyatt admitted. "Or they could be simple travelers. Either way, we'll be at the cabin soon. If they're just passing through, they'll continue on. If not—" His hand drifted to the rifle in its scabbard. The riders, 3 men on horseback, maintained their distance behind them all the way to the cabin. As Wyatt and Rebecca dismounted, the men crested the final rise in the trail and approached at a trot. "Get inside," Wyatt said quietly. "Stay out of sight." Rebecca hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone. "Go," he insisted. "If there's trouble, there's a loaded shotgun under the bed." She nodded and hurried inside, watching through a window as the riders approached. From this distance, she could see that they wore fine clothing, city clothes rather than the practical attire of frontiersmen. One man, barrel-chested with a thick mustache, seemed to be in charge, gesturing authoritatively as they rode into the yard. Wyatt stood his ground, one hand casually resting on his holstered revolver. Rebecca couldn't hear the exchange, but she saw Wyatt shake his head, saw the leader become more agitated, jabbing a finger in the direction of the cabin. Her stomach twisted with fear. They were looking for her, they had to be. Had someone in town recognized her? Or had they been tracking her since yesterday? The confrontation outside escalated, voices raised though the words remained indistinct. Then, to Rebecca's horror, the leader drew his pistol. Wyatt's reaction was lightning fast, his own gun clearing its holster in a smooth motion as he dove to the side, rolling behind a water trough as shots rang out. Rebecca gasped, ducking below the window as bullets splintered the wooden frame. She scrambled to the bedroom, yanking the shotgun from beneath the bed. Her hands shook as she checked that it was loaded, just as Wyatt had said. More gunfire erupted outside. Rebecca crept back to the window, staying low. Wyatt had taken position behind a stack of firewood, exchanging shots with the men who had spread out, using their horses and outbuildings for cover. One of the men was trying to work his way around to the back of the cabin. Without thinking, Rebecca moved to the rear window, took aim and fired. The blast of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space, but her shot had the desired effect. The man yelped in pain and retreated, clutching his arm. The firefight continued for what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes. Rebecca moved between windows, firing when she had a clear shot, more to keep the attackers at bay than with any real hope of hitting them. She had never fired a gun in anger before, had never imagined herself in such a situation. Yet here she was, fighting alongside a man she had known for less than a day, risking her life and his. A sudden silence fell, broken only by the panicked whinnying of horses. Rebecca peered cautiously out the front window. Two of the men were retreating, one supporting the other who was clearly wounded. Of the leader there was no sign. "Wyatt," she called, suddenly fearful. No answer. Rebecca moved to the door, shotgun still at the ready. She opened it a crack, scanning the yard. The leader's body lay motionless near the well. But where was Wyatt? "Wyatt," she called again, more urgently. A groan from the direction of the barn answered her. Heart in her throat, Rebecca dashed across the open yard, heedless of potential danger. She found Wyatt slumped against the barn wall, his left arm dark with blood. "You're hurt," she gasped, kneeling beside him. "Just a graze," he managed, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "The other two, gone," Rebecca assured him. "But one's dead by the well." Wyatt grimaced. "Didn't want it to come to that. Help me inside." Rebecca supported him as they made their way back to the cabin. The wound proved to be more than a graze. A bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm, leaving a ragged hole that bled profusely. "In the trunk," Wyatt directed through gritted teeth. "Medical supplies." Rebecca found bandages, a bottle of whiskey, and a sewing kit. She had sewn up minor wounds on the farm before cuts from farm implements, a dog bite but never a gunshot wound. Still, the principle was the same. "This will hurt," she warned as she cleaned the wound with whiskey. Wyatt's only response was a sharp intake of breath, his face set in lines of pain. Rebecca worked efficiently, washing away the blood, determining that the bullet had passed clean through, then stitching both entry and exit wounds closed with neat, tiny stitches. Finally, she bound the arm securely with clean bandages. "You've done this before," Wyatt observed as she tied off the last bandage. "On animals mostly," Rebecca admitted. "But flesh is flesh." "Thank you," he said simply. Rebecca nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by all that had happened. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling now that the immediate crisis had passed. Those men, they were Pinkertons, weren't they? "Hired guns, most likely," Wyatt confirmed. "Not lawmen, no badges, no attempt to arrest, just shooting." "They would have killed you," Rebecca said, the reality of it hitting her fully. "Because of me." They made their choice when they drew first, Wyatt said firmly. This isn't on you. But Rebecca couldn't shake the guilt. This man had saved her life twice now and nearly lost his own in the process. All because she had run from a marriage she couldn't face. We need to leave, Wyatt said, interrupting her thoughts. Tonight, those two will be back with reinforcements. You're in no condition to travel, Rebecca protested. Better to travel wounded than wait here to be killed, Wyatt countered. We'll take the North Trail. It's rougher terrain, but less likely they'll expect us to go that way. Rebecca wanted to argue further, but the determined set of his jaw told her it would be futile. Instead, she nodded and began gathering their supplies, mentally preparing for the journey ahead. They buried the dead man far from the cabin, a grim task made more difficult by Wyatt's injury. Rebecca did most of the digging, refusing Wyatt's attempts to help. As she worked, she couldn't help but wonder about the man, who he was, if he had family waiting for his return. Had he known what he was getting into when he took Pinkerton's money? Had he considered the possibility that he might die in the wilderness, far from home, in pursuit of a runaway bride? By nightfall, they were ready to depart. Wyatt had selected his 3 strongest horses, Thunder, and 2 others named Storm and Midnight. They packed lightly, taking only what they absolutely needed. Rebecca donned her new practical clothing, sturdy trousers, flannel shirt, leather vest, and boots, and tied her long auburn hair back under a wide-brimmed hat. "How do I look?" she asked, attempting humor despite the gravity of their situation. Wyatt studied her for a moment, his expression softening, like a woman who knows her own mind. It was perhaps the finest compliment Rebecca had ever received. They set out under cover of darkness, leaving the cabin that had briefly been their sanctuary. Rebecca felt a pang as they rode away. Would Wyatt ever be able to return to his home? Had her presence in his life cost him everything he had built here? The North Trail proved to be as challenging as Wyatt had warned. It wound through steep, rocky terrain, often narrowing to a path barely wide enough for a single horse. They rode in silence, alert for any sound that might indicate pursuit. Wyatt led the way despite his injury, which Rebecca could tell pained him greatly, though he made no complaint. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles of difficult terrain. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, concealed from the trail by a stand of pines. While Wyatt tended the horses, Rebecca prepared a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and coffee. "We should reach the Montana Territory in 4 days if we maintain this pace," Wyatt said as they ate. "Then another 3 to Helena." Rebecca nodded, too exhausted for conversation. The events of the past 2 days seemed unreal. How had her life changed so dramatically in such a short time? Just 48 hours ago, she had been preparing to walk down the aisle to marry Harold Pinkerton. Now she was a fugitive, fleeing for her life with a wounded cowboy she barely knew yet trusted implicitly. "You should rest," Wyatt told her, noting her fatigue. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest more than I do," Rebecca countered. "That wound needs time to heal." They compromised, agreeing to take turns standing watch while the other slept. But when Rebecca woke from her brief, fitful sleep, she found Wyatt still awake, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You didn't wake me for my turn," she accused. "You needed the sleep," he said simply. Rebecca sighed in exasperation. "Your arm won't heal if you don't rest, Wyatt, and if it becomes infected, we'll both be in trouble." He conceded the point with a reluctant nod. "Tonight," he promised. "I'll sleep tonight." Their journey continued in this pattern for the next several days, hard riding by day, brief rest at night, always watchful for signs of pursuit. They avoided settlements and other travelers when possible, taking the most isolated routes even when it meant more difficult terrain. Despite the circumstances, Rebecca found herself drawing strength from Wyatt's quiet resilience. He never complained about his injury, never spoke of the home he had been forced to abandon, never blamed her for the upheaval in his life. His stoicism inspired her to match it with her own determination. On their fourth day of travel, as they crossed into Montana territory, Wyatt's prediction of pursuit proved accurate. They spotted riders in the distance, following their trail with grim purpose. 6 of them, Wyatt said grimly after studying them through a spyglass. Well armed. What do we do? Rebecca asked, fighting to keep panic from her voice. Wyatt studied the terrain ahead. There's a place about 2 miles from here, a narrow canyon with steep walls. Good place for an ambush. We might even the odds a bit. Rebecca looked at him in surprise. You mean to fight? I mean to survive, Wyatt corrected. And make sure you do too. They rode hard for the canyon, pushing their tired horses to their limits. As they entered the narrow passage, Wyatt quickly laid out his plan. They would continue through to the far end, then double back on foot to take positions on the canyon walls. When I give the signal, start shooting, he instructed, handing Rebecca a rifle. Aim for the horses first. Unseated men are less mobile, less dangerous. Rebecca nodded, trying to quell her fear. She had never imagined herself in a gunfight once, let alone twice in the space of a week. Yet here she was, preparing to ambush 6 armed men alongside a cowboy she had met just days ago. They secured the horses in a grove of trees beyond the canyon, then made their way back on foot, climbing to positions that offered good visibility and cover. The wait seemed interminable. Rebecca's hands grew slick with sweat on the rifle, and she wiped them repeatedly on her trousers. Finally, the riders appeared at the canyon entrance, moving cautiously now, clearly aware they were entering a potential trap. Rebecca recognized the 2 survivors from the gunfight at the cabin, now accompanied by 4 new men, all heavily armed and wearing the determined expressions of experienced killers. Wyatt waited until they were fully committed to the canyon before giving the signal, a bird call that sounded natural enough to avoid immediate alarm. Rebecca took aim at the lead rider's horse and squeezed the trigger. The canyon erupted into chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted and returned fire wildly, unable to determine the source of the attack. Rebecca and Wyatt maintained their positions, firing methodically, forcing the pursuers to seek inadequate cover among the boulders on the canyon floor. 2 of the men managed to scramble up the canyon wall on the opposite side, gaining a position from which they could return fire more effectively. Rebecca found herself pinned down as bullets chipped away at the rocks around her. Wyatt. She called in warning, but he was engaged with the men below, unaware of the new threat. Acting on instinct, Rebecca rolled to a new position and took careful aim at the closer of the 2 men. She exhaled slowly, just as Wyatt had taught her during their journey, and squeezed the trigger. The man jerked backward, his rifle tumbling from lifeless hands. His companion immediately focused fire on Rebecca's position. Bullets whizzed past her head as she scrambled for better cover. One caught the edge of her hat, spinning it from her head. Another tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm with burning heat. Then Wyatt's rifle cracked from a new position and the second man on the ridge fell. Rebecca, Wyatt called. Fall back, now. She retreated as directed, working her way along the ridge toward the rear of the canyon where their horses waited. Wyatt provided covering fire, holding the remaining pursuers at bay until she reached safety, then followed. They mounted quickly and rode hard, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the canyon before nightfall forced them to make camp. As they sat by a small, carefully screened fire, Rebecca examined the graze on her arm. It was painful but superficial, requiring only cleaning and a simple bandage. "You did well back there," Wyatt said quietly. "Not many people could have made that shot under pressure." "I was terrified," Rebecca admitted, "but I couldn't let them flank you." Wyatt's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "Why did you do it, Rebecca? Why risk yourself for me?" The question caught her off guard. "You've risked everything for me," she said after a moment. "Your home, your livelihood, your life. How could I do any less?" "I chose this," Wyatt pointed out. "You didn't ask me to get involved." "No," Rebecca acknowledged. "But you did it anyway. That kind of selflessness deserves to be honored in kind." Wyatt was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "It wasn't entirely selfless," he finally said, so softly she almost didn't hear. "What do you mean?" He looked up, meeting her eyes across the fire. "From the moment I saw you on that cliff, something about you." He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "I didn't want to let you go," he finally admitted. "Even knowing the danger, even knowing it meant leaving everything behind, I couldn't bear the thought of not knowing what happened to you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Rebecca felt her heart quicken, recognizing the truth that had been building between them throughout their journey. "I feel it too," she whispered. "This connection, it makes no sense. We barely know each other." "I know enough," Wyatt said simply. "I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you stand by your principles even when it costs you dearly. I know you can stitch a wound and shoot straight and ride all day without complaint." Rebecca smiled despite herself. "Such romantic observations." "I'm not a poetic man," Wyatt said with a hint of a smile. "But I know what matters in this life. And you, Rebecca Dawson, matter to me." She moved around the fire then, settling beside him on the ground. Tentatively, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You matter to me too, Wyatt Blackburn." More than I ever expected anyone could in so short a time. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, rough calluses gentle against her skin. When he leaned in to kiss her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if all the chaos and danger of the past days had been leading to this moment of perfect clarity. The kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, Rebecca was breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not sure that was wise," she said, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. "Probably not," Wyatt agreed, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "But I'm tired of making the wise choice. Sometimes the right choice is the one that feels true, even if it doesn't make sense on paper." Rebecca leaned into his touch, understanding exactly what he meant. Her entire life had been governed by practicality and duty. Running from her wedding had been her first act of true rebellion, of choosing her heart over her head. This whatever was growing between her and Wyatt felt like an extension of that choice. Impractical, perhaps even foolish, but undeniably right. They spent the night talking, sharing the stories of their lives in greater detail than before. Rebecca told him about growing up on the farm near Cheyenne, about losing her brother in the war, about her father's subsequent decline into gambling and drinking that had led to his debts to Ezra Pinkerton. Wyatt spoke of his Pennsylvania childhood, his time in the Union Army, the nightmares that still haunted him from battles long past, and his gradual healing in the wide open spaces of the West. By dawn, Rebecca felt as though she had known Wyatt for years rather than days. There was an ease between them now, a comfort in each other's presence that defied their brief acquaintance. They reached Helena 3 days later without further incident. The city was larger than Rebecca had expected, bustling with the activity of a mining boom town. Gold and silver had brought prosperity to Helena, evident in the substantial buildings lining its main streets, the well-dressed citizens, and the general air of optimism. Wyatt led them to a modest hotel on the outskirts of town, away from the main thoroughfares where they might be more easily spotted by anyone still searching for them. "We'll stay here tonight," he said as they settled their horses at the livery stable. "Tomorrow I'll see about selling the horses, then we can figure out next steps." Rebecca nodded, suddenly uncertain. Now that they had reached their destination, what came next? Would Wyatt expect her to make her own way now? The thought of separating from him created an unexpected ache in her chest. The hotel room was simple but clean, with a single bed that made Rebecca acutely aware of their undefined relationship. Wyatt, ever the gentleman, immediately offered to sleep on the floor. "Don't be ridiculous," Rebecca said practically. "Your arm is still healing, and you've spent enough nights on hard ground recently. The bed is plenty big enough for both of us." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "What happened to the proper young lady I rescued from the cliff?" "She learned that some proprieties matter less than kindness and common sense," Rebecca replied with a smile. "Besides, after all we've been through, sharing a bed for sleep seems a minor concern." After washing away the dust of travel and changing into clean clothes purchased from a shop near the hotel, they ventured out for dinner at a nearby restaurant. It felt strange to be sitting at a proper table, eating a meal they hadn't cooked themselves over a campfire. Rebecca found herself constantly scanning the room for potential threats, a habit she had developed over their journey. "You're jumpier than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs," Wyatt observed quietly. Rebecca smiled at the colorful expression. "I keep expecting Pinkerton's men to burst through the door. We're a long way from Wyoming," Wyatt reminded her, "and I doubt even Ezra Pinkerton would spend the resources to track a runaway bride this far." "I hope you're right," Rebecca said. "But I'll feel better once I've established myself here with a new name and identity." Wyatt nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. What would you say to Rebecca Blackburn?" Rebecca froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Are you proposing?" "Inelegantly, it seems," Wyatt admitted with a rueful smile. "But yes, I know it's sudden, I know we've only known each other for a short time, but yes," Rebecca interrupted. Wyatt blinked. "Yes, yes," she repeated firmly. "I'll marry you, Wyatt Blackburn." His face broke into a genuine smile, the first unguarded expression of joy she had seen from him. Just like that," Rebecca confirmed. "Some things don't need long contemplation. Some things you just know." They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace, with 2 strangers as witnesses. Rebecca wore a simple blue dress purchased from a local shop, and Wyatt wore the cleanest of his trail clothes. It wasn't the elaborate ceremony that had been planned for her wedding to Harold Pinkerton, with its 100 guests and expensive decorations. But as Rebecca spoke her vows to Wyatt, she knew with absolute certainty that this simple ceremony held more genuine feeling and promise than the grand wedding she had fled. With the horses sold for a handsome sum, and Rebecca now legally Rebecca Blackburn, they began to build a life in Helena. They purchased a small house on the edge of town, and Wyatt found work breaking horses for local ranchers, his reputation as a skilled horseman quickly spreading. Rebecca, using her education, secured a position teaching at the local school. Months passed without any sign of pursuit from the Pinkertons. Gradually, Rebecca's fear began to fade, replaced by a growing contentment in her new life. She and Wyatt settled into marriage with surprising ease, their bond deepening with each passing day. What had begun in danger and desperation had transformed into something solid and nurturing, a partnership of equals built on mutual respect and growing love. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson, Wyatt took Rebecca's hand in his. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I regret the danger I brought into your life," she said finally. "I regret that you had to leave your home because of me." "I don't," Wyatt said simply. "Home isn't a place, Rebecca. It's a feeling. And I feel more at home with you in this little house than I ever did alone in that cabin." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, warmed by his words. "Then no," she said. "No regrets." "I've been thinking," Wyatt said after a comfortable silence. "With the money from the horses and what we've saved, we could buy a small ranch outside of town, start breeding horses again, build something that's ours together." Rebecca smiled at the idea. "I'd like that," she said. "A place where we could put down roots, maybe start a family." Wyatt's arm tightened around her. "A family," he repeated softly. "I'd like that too." By the following spring, they had purchased a modest ranch 10 miles outside of Helena. The land included good pasture for horses, a small stream, and a view of the mountains that took Rebecca's breath away. The house needed work, but it was solid and spacious enough for the family they hoped to have. They moved in on a bright April day, the air filled with the scent of new growth and possibility. As they stood on the porch of their new home, Wyatt pulled Rebecca into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackburn," he said softly. Rebecca looked up at him, this man who had led her step by careful step from danger to safety, from despair to hope, from loneliness to love. "Home," she agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. At last. 5 years later, the Blackburn Ranch had flourished. Wyatt's skill with horses had made their breeding stock sought after throughout the territory, and Rebecca continued to teach, riding into town 3 days a week while Wyatt cared for their 3-year-old son, William. On a crisp autumn afternoon, not unlike the day they had first met, Rebecca returned from town to find Wyatt and William waiting for her on the porch. Her son ran to her, his small face alight with excitement. "Mama, Papa showed me the new foal. She has a white star just like thunder." Rebecca scooped him up, pressing a kiss to his chubby cheek. "Did he now? And did you remember to be quiet and gentle around her?" William nodded solemnly. "Papa says horses spook easy, just like you did when he found you on the mountain." Rebecca looked up at Wyatt, who shrugged with a smile. "He asked how we met. I told him the truth, that I found the most beautiful, brave woman in the world standing frozen on a cliff, and I knew right then I had to keep her safe. And then you fell in love and got married and had me," William finished triumphantly. "That's right," Rebecca agreed, carrying him up the steps to where Wyatt waited, though it took a few adventures in between. Wyatt's arm slipped around her waist as they entered the house together. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured in her ear, dismounting from that horse to help a runaway bride. Rebecca leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had survived together, all they had built. From a moment of terror on a narrow mountain trail to this life of love and purpose, it had been quite a journey. "Best decision I ever made, too," she whispered back, "trusting you to lead me to safety step by step." And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the path to happiness began with a single, terrifying step into the unknown.